And do feel free to comment, but please don't be abusive, as that will not be tolerated. And in the very unlikely instance of anyone persisting with abuse after a warning, they would be removed from the workshop. So to the workshop. I'm a person with ME and not a researcher, and I have no expertise in underserved groups. But I have been involved with attempting to get research funding for clinical studies in ME for the past 14 years, and I felt this workshop's theme was important. I'm starting by covering what ME is. Here's a definition to aid clinical diagnosis, as there's currently no diagnostic test for ME. There are plenty of abnormalities, biomedical, immunological, brain scans, and physiological, but none are yet usable in an outpatient clinic or even in research to tightly define the illness we currently call ME. There are a lot of additional symptoms which all affect people differently. There's also a great deal of overlap between other fatiguing illnesses, including fibromyalgia and long COVID, and several associated syndromes, including postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome and irritable bowel syndrome. One symptom of ME is characteristic and is necessary for the diagnosis: post-exertional malaise. Any overexertion, physical, mental, or emotional on one day can cause a deterioration later. And the deterioration in fatigue, pain, and many other symptoms could last for days, weeks, or even months. This, with the multitude of apparently unrelated symptoms, the cognitive impairment, and the fatigue making any interaction draining, means that explaining the condition to healthcare professionals is challenging. If a person from an underserved community also has ME, one can understand that where there are barriers to communication, it may be almost impossible to explain how ill one feels and the multitude of symptoms experienced. Obvious barriers might be socioeconomic, cultural, or language, particularly if English is not a first language. But barriers also exist for children, for those who are deaf or with learning disabilities. And of course, the severely ill can find communication even with their closest is desperately taxing. We know about the effects of systemic racism in the UK, including in employment, the police and criminal justice systems, and in health, where it is responsible for worse health outcomes in a great many areas. Whilst the barriers are very different, the experiences of all underserved groups include ignorance, trivialisation, lack of belief, and mistreatment by those in positions of power. People with ME often report similar experiences. Although the experiences of racism in our society and of being a person with ME are very different, I think the repeated experiences of not being believed or trivialized, particularly by people in positions of trust and authority, leads to cumulative trauma. Just as we want people to understand and believe our experiences with ME, I ask that we listen, respect, and believe the experiences of those who are minoritized in our society. As this is the start of a journey for many of us, can I apologise if we get the language wrong or appear ignorant? I hope the fact that we're here today means we can learn and do better in future. Finally, about the breakout rooms. I'm going to put in chat the choices for the breakout rooms. Please message Claire Ogden if you've not already specified your choice. If you're leaving before the breakout rooms start, please also tell her so she can balance the groups. I'm going to put up some slides during the breaks in the workshop, which aim to help the breakout rooms run smoothly. Please have a look at them. We're not coming back together at the end of the breakout rooms, so I'm asking the leaders of each group to email me afterwards to tell me what people felt were the research priorities in that area and a quick summary of the discussion direction. It would be wonderful if there were researchers or clinicians here today who were interested in taking any of these ideas forward. Do keep in touch if that is so. As far as I know, this is the first workshop or meeting in the UK thinking about the relevance of underserved groups to the research and care of people with ME. We cannot cover all areas and will not solve any issues in the time available, but I do hope this workshop is the start of a continuing conversation in these areas and to approaching them from a research perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica. As always, that was a very clear and succinct way of setting the stage. I think we go on to the First speaker now, Dr. Anna Hood from the University of Manchester, from the Anti-Racism Coalition in Pain Research, who researched the cumulative effects of racism-based trauma on pain and cognitive and psychological outcome measures in clinical trials of children and young people with sickle cell disease. Sorry.
Can you hear me?
You there? Yeah. Hi, Anna.
Right. I'll just go ahead and share my slides. All right. Can you see my slides? Perfect. All right, I'll begin. Wonderful. All right. Thank you so much for the invitation from Monica to come and speak today. So, as you mentioned, I'm a lecturer in psychology at the University of Manchester. I am going to be, there's a few things I'm going to be going over today, and I only have 15 minutes, so I did want to try and cover a few different areas. But this is some work that began really in 2020, led by a colleague of mine, and really thinking about how we consider pain outcomes. And so oftentimes in the work I do is in pediatric pain. I do a lot of work with young people with sickle cell, as I'll be talking about in a moment. But we think about pain outcomes, and I imagine some of this is very similar to ME in that the individual processes are the primary focus. So how is an individual responding cognitively, emotionally, behaviorally, and sometimes biologically? But what we don't do is really think about that larger system within which individuals live. And so there's some work really thinking about that interpersonal relationships and how justice or injustice might manifest, but very little work thinking about structural and cultural factors. So cultural values, history and systems of oppression, institutions that oftentimes are not fit for purpose or fit for individuals who are from minoritized backgrounds. So I often think of this mechanism of justice as sort of a soup, which might sound quite strange, but thinking about that everybody sort of has to make their way through the soup, and some people get a paddle, some people get a rowboat, other people just have to trudge through by themselves. But we all have to make our way through here, and we have to start acknowledging and considering these other aspects of injustice, not just focusing on individual processes. We published, I think now a couple of years ago, our Confronting Racism in Pain research series. This is in the Journal of Pain. I will be talking a little bit about primarily this reframing studies, and I'll be sharing my slides with Monica. So these studies are all freely available to be able to discuss, really thinking about, the first was a call to action. Next, how we change how we do our research, and then who do we involve in our research, how do we engage, how do we disseminate carefully and with people with lived experience at the focus. I share this study because this was again conducted around 2020, 2021, but this is a UK focused study. This was led by some researchers at Cambridge. And it was 10,000 Black British voices and thinking about lots of aspects of living in the UK while being Black. But this particular, what I've pulled out here is around healthcare experiences. And I think it's startling. So less than 1 in 60 respondents felt they were fairly treated within the healthcare system and actually consider it a hostile environment, which I think is quite stark. And 87% of respondents reported that they expect to receive a substandard level of healthcare because of their race. So this is sort of the situation in which people are being treated and feel. As I mentioned earlier, my research primarily focuses on children and young people who are living with sickle cell. I'm happy to talk more about that. I normally go into quite a bit of detail because there's generally some more or less knowledge in the audience about it. But just to say that sickle cell, one of the some of the primary factors and things that I research is looking at cognitive deficits. So there's a lack of oxygen in sickle cell. So the sickled cell, that's the red blood cell, there's a mutation in something called the hemoglobin. That hemoglobin means that there's not enough oxygen getting around the body. The brain requires a lot of oxygen. And so not enough oxygen challenges to the brain. And so we used to, before treatment, see many people have a stroke. There's less now, but there are still brain challenges. And what we see as a result of that is challenges across cognitive areas, particularly focused on executive function, which is sort of here, the front of the brain, and processing speed, how quickly we can process new and novel information. The other thing about sickle cell is it affects different people in different ways. So having a lack of oxygen to the different organs obviously can cause challenges, but it almost always includes pain at some point for some people. And so the primary reason they're often at the A&E is because of the experience of pain. And there was a no one's listening report. This is an all parliamentary report, actually, and co-produced with the Sickle Cell Society. Really, the name No One's Listening was apt, and some of the findings from that were quite, again, stark. So finding that patients living with sickle cell experience substandard care, gaps in physician knowledge regarding disease pathophysiology. There were concerns about opioid misuse, implicit bias, and structural barriers to care. Negative attitudes were found, and they were underpinned by racism and stigmatizing language used, people being called sicklers or drug seekers in the medical record. And this was contributing to less aggressive pain measures. This was an article in the New York Times, and I think this headline is quite apt. And so pain in children is often ignored, but for children of color, it is even worse. And so this was some research done in the US. So this Goyal has done a series of these studies, but I just show one here. And this is not looking at sickle, this is looking at just Black children who go into the emergency department, so in the A&E, who have an appendicitis. And those children were significantly less likely to receive opioid analgesia than white children, so less pain medication. And so there's this real racialization of opioid prescriptions, and I'm happy to talk in more detail if anybody wants some information there. But just to show on this graph, you can see the difference over time. So this isn't at just one time point. At every time point, we're seeing there's differences. These are white children, and these are non-Hispanic Black children receiving less opioids across the time. So this who gets opioids is the division is based oftentimes on race. And as I said, there's a series of studies that have looked at this in lots of different types of reasons somebody might go to the A&E for pain. And so one of the things myself and colleagues were trying to challenge is we didn't want to just document the problem anymore. We know we have a problem. We need to start looking at interventions to fix the problem. So that was the impetus for the restorative model, which I'll talk about next. I do want to always make sure I am the lead of this project, but as you can see, there was a wonderful group of women who are excellent scholars, and we span, a lot of us are psychologists as well, some more in clinical practice, some in research, but we also have physiotherapists, social workers, anesthesiologists, epidemiologists. So a real mix, a multidisciplinary team to come at this question. One of the drivers of the restorative model is racism-based traumatic stress. That might be a new term to some in the group, but that is significant emotional and mental injury caused by frequent uncontrollable, right? You can't control if you're going to experience a racist experience, and encounters, and experiencing those as stress-inducing with the potential to produce a traumatic response. And they can have psychological and physiological symptoms. This was from a recent UK study. So it had young children actually draw a body map. So draw their bodies and actually map onto their bodies where they were experiencing racism and how it felt in different parts of their body and what emotions they were experiencing. And I pull this quote because I think it's indicative. So this quote says, "I liked talking and discussing important topics like racism. because we usually only talk about racism in Black History Week, or when we learn about slavery, or when a racial incident happens. I would like to talk more about racism, the little racist incidents, and how we feel about them, because it has such a big impact on us. And that was a young boy who shared that quote. So in the restorative model, the RBTS is the racism-based traumatic stress, and pain had not yet been explored together. And so the restorative model has a long name, and that's why we went with restorative, but it's the racism exposure and trauma accumulation perpetuate pain inequities. But importantly, that we're advocating for change. And this is a novel model that integrates the models of racism and pain and looks at that shared contribution. And so this is the model, right? So we've got our model of pain, and those, if we remember from my first slide, so those outer, cultural and structural factors. We've got our biopsychosocial model that's mirrored in our racism model and our pain models, and that they're all coming together to create PTSD-like and racism-based traumatic stress symptoms that contribute to pain inequities. And for individuals, we have that focus on individual processes that I mentioned earlier, but also this discounting in intersectionality. And intersectionality is the fact that for me, I am a Black woman living in the UK. I lived for a long time in the US. All of those things contribute to who I am and how I experience the world. And as I said, critically, we're thinking about a path to restoration. We want change. And so this is thinking again about how we achieve pain equity. Again, I'll be sharing the slides with Monica. This QR code will send you to the paper for those who are interested, and it is also freely available. At the center of the restorative model is cultural humility. So some of you might have heard of cultural competence, but competence asks that we become competent in something else, and essentially might become an expert. Which is a good starting point to understand culture, but nobody can be an expert in somebody else's culture. And if you think of intersectionality, that challenging becomes vanishingly small. So now we have to think about cultural humility. And that's a process of openness, humility, and self-awareness in a world where power imbalances exist, striving for mutual empowerment, respect, and lifelong learning. And a process wherein learning is infinite, centered on an iterative approach of self-reflection and self-evaluation. And when I teach this to my students, one student just asked me the other day and said, Anna, is that not just being a good human? And I said, yeah, really it is. And I think this humility, particularly in our healthcare system, would go a long way for many conditions, including the work I do with young people with sickle cell. So I'm just going to give a couple of examples. Again, this is in our second paper of the Confronting Racism series, but just to how we can think about using the restorative model in our work. And so there are some misconceptions, I believe, in science, right? Science is completely objective, that we as actors, me as a researcher, come in as a clean slate, and the research is completely subjective. I suggest we put things in a box, and then those confounders we try to think might not exist. In addition, who I am, who any of us are, plays a role in how we design and interpret our studies. Second misconception is that anti-racism is only socio-political and introduces bias. To be honest, I wish I didn't have to talk about anti-racism, bias, and discrimination. But if we don't, what happens is large-scale studies only include those from white perspectives and those with those lived experiences. And so we have to be able to include that. And those studies, I think, improve transferability, and so increase rigor and impact when we include all people from all populations who are experiencing a particular healthcare challenge. Representativeness. So this is one of the things we're thinking about. You'll hear sort of representativeness and inclusion. And the way I think about this for research is representativeness is who is in the room. So oftentimes what we do as researchers is represent the characteristics of a larger population. So here in the UK, we might base that on the census. But if we want to really hear about some of those intersections, we have to start thinking about inclusivity, whose voice is heard, because if we just go on the census data, 8%, for example, in the UK are Black. And so if we want to analyze and understand why sometimes we see these disparities in inequities specifically for certain groups, we've got to include inclusivity, whose voice is heard, so we can understand their specific experiences and clinical outcomes. And so generalizability only looks at the sort of the largest group representation, but demographic compositions are changing in the global north, so here in the UK, US, and excludes the pain experiences of people in the global south. Groups with the highest burden oftentimes have the least representation. So 70% of people impacted by chronic pain are women. 80% of the pain studies are conducted on male mice or human men. So just finally, to wrap up, I do think we stand at a place of movement towards change. I think my work in pain, and I think hopefully across the work that you are all doing and considering, as an academic discipline and a clinical field, can explore issues of racialized identity, culture, colonialism, and in our research and clinical care. And finally, I'll just end with a quote. So if you change a generation of scientists, you're changing the patterns of society itself. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, we have some time for discussion later, Anna.
Okay.
In the interest of time, I thought that was a really interesting and humbling presentation. We'll come back to that. Thank you so much. Next, we have Helen Baxter from 25% ME Group, advocate for people with severe and very severe MECFS, who was published on life-threatening malnutrition in very severe MECFS and on involving people with severe and very severe MECFS in research. Are you on?
Yes, I am. Thank you. I'm just about to share my screen.
All right. We're a couple of minutes behind, but I'll give you the time that you need. Yeah.
Can you see that?
Yep. Yeah, that's all good.
Thank you for inviting me to speak and for organising these workshops, Monica. For those of you who haven't heard of 25% ME Group, we're a national charity which supports and advocates for people with very severe and severe ME. And the 25% comes from the fact that it's estimated 25% of people with ME have severe or very severe ME. Myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome.
We've lost your sound, Helen.
Yes, I don't know what's happened.
Back
Hang on.
now.
We can stay here now.
Myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, affects approximately 250,000 people in the UK. And as I've said, 25% are classed as having severe or very severe ME and are housebound or bedbound. So how do we define severe and very severe ME? NICE defines people with severe ME as either housebound or unable to leave the house without it having a prolonged effect and may spend much of their time in bed, and at best only able to do minimal tasks such as teeth cleaning and having severe cognitive difficulties and may need a wheelchair. And NICE defines people with very severe ME as totally bedbound, needing help with personal care and eating and very sensitive to stimuli, and may have difficulties with swallowing and need tube feeding. I would just add to that that people with very severe ME are usually totally dependent on care, may need 24-hour care, usually in a darkened room because of their severe sensitivities to light, often with ear defenders on because of noise sensitivities, and can experience high levels of pain, nausea, vomiting, and they may be catheterized. They may also have significant difficulties communicating, and some won't be able to speak at all. ME is under-researched and has historically received insufficient funding for research, particularly when compared to chronic conditions such as multiple sclerosis. And most of the research that has been done about it has focused on patients who are able to attend clinics. People with severe ME have largely been excluded from research due to the severity of their illness and are often described as hard to reach. And consequently, research into severe ME is very limited. A special edition of Healthcare focusing on severe and very severe ME led to the publication of 25 articles, but none of them looked at ways to engage this patient group in research. When researchers have tried to involve patients with severe ME in research, they have found poor uptake of questionnaires, participants feeling burdened by them, and the questionnaires subsequently being returned incomplete. The increased time and cost associated with providing the necessary support to try to enable people with severe ME to participate has also been highlighted. However, researchers did acknowledge that with increased support to the participants, more could be realised. Those of you who were at the first workshop will have heard Caroline Kingdon's excellent presentation on how she visited people with very severe ME in their homes and the measures she took in order to do her research. So, at 25% ME group, we had become aware that patients needing tube feeding, both enterally or parenterally, were experiencing delays, life-threatening delays, in getting it implemented, and we were concerned about the response of clinicians. I will come on to talk about that later. So we wanted to collect data from charity members. A study questionnaire was devised which took into account the problems previous researchers had when trying to engage people with severe ME in research. As a charity, we're acutely aware of the cognitive difficulties faced by members. For example, the difficulties they have meeting deadlines, for instance, when returning benefit forms, and the assistance they require when completing paperwork, and also the sensitivity to stimuli, which means that for some people with severe and very severe ME, they can't look at a screen, and some of our members simply can't afford the internet. We designed the study to be as simple as possible and used Microsoft Word to ensure participants could save it and come back to it as and when their health allowed, if they did choose to complete it on screen, and that it could be easily printed. As you'll see at the beginning of the questionnaire, it clearly tells the participant which part of the questionnaire they need to complete, depending on the method of artificial nutrition. This conserves energy and saves time for the participant and negates the need to look through the whole of the document. Questions included type and duration of artificial nutrition. As you can see, there's a compulsory section 6. Section 6 was a set of simple questions about participants' experience prior to or whilst accessing tube feeding, requiring yes/no answers. There was also an open-ended section asking for any other relevant information. An invitation to take part in the survey was put in the charity newsletter in summer 2019, which is posted to all of our members. The invitation stated the questionnaire was short and simple to complete. It was put towards the beginning of the newsletter to make it more likely for members to see it. We know at best members are only able to look at the newsletter in small amounts, and some members can't look at it at all. The questionnaire was available by email or post. As 25% ME group know, some members are unable to read the newsletter due to the severity of their ME. So direct outreach was used to contact members who we knew met the criteria but were too ill to read the newsletter. They were very keen to participate once they were aware of the research taking place. The option to complete the survey via telephone or by text, whichever communication method they found easiest, was also made available. This method has since gone on to be used in the James Lind Alliance Priority Setting Partnership and for Decode ME. Appointments were made on the understanding that they may have to be cancelled at short notice. Other reasonable adjustments were put in place to encourage participants to participate whilst minimising the risk of causing post-exertional malaise. These included not setting a deadline and allowing family members or home care workers to complete or assist in completing the questionnaire. Of those who initially expressed interest, all went on to complete the questionnaire. Only one member was able to request and complete the questionnaire without help, despite its simplicity. It's worth noting the only questionnaire completed on screen was done by a family member without direct input from the person with very severe ME. But the family member had been with the patient and advocated for the patient whilst they were trying to access tube feeding. The third questionnaire was completed by the patient and their family. All were returned electronically. Of the 2 members who needed to complete the questionnaire by telephone or text, one completed it solely by telephone in multiple short appointments, whilst the other communicated some of the information through her home care worker and some through a texting dialogue as she'd lost the ability to speak. The time taken to complete the questionnaire varied. Where it was completed by a family member, it was returned in 3 days. But it took a year for another participant to complete the questionnaire due to the severity of their ME and the need for significant rest periods between appointments. Appointments were cancelled at short notice due to problems such as migraines and seizures. The Any Other Relevant Information section received a significant response from all participants. They all wanted to share their experiences in the hope it would prevent future participants going through the same ordeal. These were published as a case report. With the 2 participants who completed the questionnaire by telephone or text, it was possible to listen to them speaking freely about their lived experience and have the survey questions answered without having to ask direct questions, which patients with ME can find very cognitively challenging. Having previous experience of speaking to people with severe ME meant we listened carefully, used a slow, soft voice, and avoided asking them to repeat themselves, and just confirmed that we had heard them correctly by reading back their response. We were also conscious of the length of time the participants spent on the telephone to try to reduce the possibility of post-exertional malaise. Such was the enthusiasm to provide information, it was necessary to listen for signs of fatigue in their voice, and at times to say, "You're sounding tired. Shall we leave it for today?" This reminded the participant they were becoming fatigued, but allowed them to make the decision whether or not to continue. Each time the participant did decide to finish at that point. By arranging to complete the survey by these means, we avoided the sensory overload that can be experienced during a home visit. Patients were more likely to cancel a telephone appointment than a home visit, thus reducing the risk of causing post-exertional malaise, nor were we restricted geographically, which meant we were able to get information about the attitudes and practices of NHS clinicians, hospital departments, and clinical commissioning groups around the UK. As I have said, some patients with severe and very severe ME won't have access to the internet or computer equipment, either because they can't tolerate the sensory stimulus from a screen, or they don't have the technical know-how or anyone to help them, or because they can't afford it. So it's important to ensure invitations to participate in research are available in a paper format, likewise with the questionnaire or survey. With a reduction in the provision of social care in the UK, home care workers do not necessarily have time to complete surveys with their clients, nor do clients necessarily want to share information of this nature with them. Thus, the role of the investigator providing flexible communication methods becomes invaluable. If you are looking to put in a grant application, either to do research across the disease spectrum or just severe and very severe ME, you need to include the additional support which patients with very severe ME are going to need to participate, such as providing a provision for printing paper copies of the survey into the research budget. Providing telephone and text support will be much more cost effective than making home visits. But where physical samples are required, researchers do need to visit patients in their own homes, and this needs to be budgeted for. You also need to be realistic about timeframes on your grant application. Recognize the additional time people with severe and very severe ME are going to need to enable them to participate. PPI entirely affected. It may be that you have family members or carers of people with severe ME on your PPI. And also think about how you're going to reach out to this group. Contacting charities and also local ME groups who are going to know who their severely affected members are can be a good way. I'm now going to move on to talk briefly about what we found out about experiences of accessing tube feeding. We published our results as a case report, which we entitled Life-Threatening Malnutrition in Very Severe ME. All the participants met our criteria. They have a diagnosis of ME from an NHS consultant physician, and because they were bedbound and receiving tube feeding, they were defined as having very severe ME according to the NICE guidelines. Common themes emerged. For example, all participants were allowed to become and remain extremely malnourished. There was evidence of clinical inertia in all cases.
You have
All,
1 or 2 minutes left, sorry.
all participants were thought to have anorexia nervosa, and psychiatrists became involved, which was an added delay to starting tube feeding. The inability to swallow was also deemed to be a psychological manifestation. In each case, the doctors resorted to making inappropriate psychological diagnosis without evidence of psychopathology, failing to recognize the significance of the malnutrition, and seemingly unaware that severe ME can lead to serious problems meeting nutritional needs, despite it being stated in the NICE guidance that patients with very severe ME may need tube feeding. On a positive note, all participants saw an improvement in their situation following the allocation of a home enteral nutrition dietitian. And this is one of the case studies from the paper. This was an adult with very severe ME. She's been diagnosed with severe ME as a child. She'd made some improvement and then deteriorated again. In her mid-30s, she was in a nursing home and started having difficulty swallowing. The speech and language therapist diagnosed dysphagia. She was seen by the community dietitian who prescribed oral nutritional supplements, but she wasn't able to tolerate these, so she became very malnourished. The primary care team just didn't seem to recognize the severity of the situation. She had 7 weeks where she really struggled to eat and drink. As the situation deteriorated, she was told if she didn't go into hospital, she would be sectioned under the Mental Health Act. So she reluctantly agreed to a voluntary admission. She then had 2 weeks in hospital where she was intermittently given intravenous fluids, but no nutrition. During this time, she was screened using the Malnutrition Universal Screening Tool. She had a score of 4. For those of you not familiar with this, a score of 2 denotes a high risk of malnutrition. So this was showing she was extremely malnourished. She deteriorated to the point that she needed an intensive care bed and a nasogastric tube was cited. But she was so malnourished that she developed an electrolyte imbalance, which had to be corrected. She also felt that she was being treated as though she had an eating disorder, despite being reliant on the tube feeding. When she was discharged, she was told it wouldn't be recited. It had to be recited a number of times as an emergency in A&E. 4 years later, the clinicians decided to give her a PEG feeding tube, which is usually given in cases where long-term tube feeding is needed. That, and being given a home enteral nutrition dietitian in the community, improved things for her, and she's now a healthy weight. To conclude,
Thanks so much, Helen. I think we need to wrap up. Can you?
Only some of the most severe ME patients were tube fed and so met our criteria for participation in this research. And by taking a flexible, patient-centered approach and making the necessary reasonable adjustments, they were enabled to participate, and they gave us some really rich data, which was invaluable in highlighting what was happening to people with very severe ME who needed tube feeding. Thank you.
Hi, Helen. That was another very thought-provoking and brilliant presentation. We're running a couple of minutes late, so I'm moving on to Professor Chris Ponting, Chair of Medical Bioinformatics at the University of Edinburgh and Principal Investigator of Decode ME, on widening recruitment to Decode ME on the one hand, and the variation in MECFS diagnostic rates across England. Chris.
Thank you, and I hope you can see the slides and hear me. So I'm going to talk to you today about who has ME in England.
Absolutely hopeless.
So we don't know very much about who has ME. There is an estimate of 250,000 people in the UK. We don't know whether it is twice or 6 times more prevalent in women as in men. The Norwegian data from hospitals indicates that there are 2 peaks of incidence, onset of ME, one in teenagers and one in middle age. And the teenager peak is not observed in the UK. We don't know very much at all about people's self-reported ethnicity, people with ME. So what we have done, we have shared our observations in a preprint on medRxiv, which you're very welcome to read. And if and when this becomes published, then the data also will be available to everyone, and that is agreed by NHS England. Our data comes from NHS England only. The data are of hospital episode statistics. So these are not GP data, but hospital data. But the data are linked to GP practices across the 42 integrated care boards in England. And we've been looking at those people for whom a code has been given, and that code is G93.3. Its description is post-viral fatigue syndrome. This is the closest that the ICD-10 code has to ME, but we acknowledge that this is not equivalent. And we compare it against over 62 million people who have data in the NHS England system, who are registered with a GP and are not deceased. This is a very large number of people and includes people who have used the NHS in England over many years, perhaps have passed through the country rather than residing within it. Among everyone, among those 62 million people, there were 100,000 people who have an ME code, a G93.3 code. And overall, nearly 4 times as many women in blue, light blue, as men in dark blue, except we need to say that the ratio is highest, and you'll see this in the orange arrows, for people between the ages of 30 and 50, where it reaches 6-fold higher women over men. And that's because the number of men with ME increases over age. So this is their current age and not the age at incidence, in other words, onset of their ME. There are very strong biases, and those biases lead to stigmatization. In fact, we think that there are 4 biases: that people have ME, that people are women, that they come from particular ethnicities, and that they are of a particular age, older age. So if we compare the numbers of people who have been diagnosed with ME with males who are white and are under the age of 40, if we compare them, then what we see at the bottom is that there are 10 times more women who are older, 41 years and above, who are white, than men who are under the age of 40, who are white with ME. And so you can see that also women who are the same age, under the age of 40, there are almost 5 times as many women as men of that age group if white. Now, on the other hand, you can also see that people who are non-white are less likely to be diagnosed. And in the comparative group between males who are under the age of 40 and white, people who are other than white have 20% the rate of diagnosis of ME. So if one considers that often the decision makers are men of a particular age, and you may consider that these people will have less lived experience of various stigmas, such as of having ME, and this will mean that they will, unless they're empathetic, will not understand those stigmas and act upon them. So why is there a 20% diagnosis rate relative to white? Why is that so? It could be that this is specific to ME. And when we looked at this across different diseases, and I show them here in different colors, of course, unfortunately, the diagnosis rate for these diseases is far lower for non-white individuals than for white, which is the ratio here of 1. So anything below this bar is a lower diagnosis rate for non-white individuals. I'm showing here people of Asian or Asian British type descent. But among all of these diseases, ME has the most reduction in diagnosis rate. And that holds true across many other self-reported ethnicities. And so we can say in general that ME diagnosis is exceptionally low across these different ethnicities, and is far lower than for white individuals. I do not believe that this has a biological explanation. We in Decode ME were very concerned that we only saw a 3% non-white participants for our project, but it matches the 5-fold difference that we see between whites and non-whites. And so it may be that what we have seen is a diagnosis bias rather than anything else. I was asked to comment on co-production. I won't have time. All I wish to say about co-production is it is incredibly valuable as a scientific tool to produce excellent science. So I would advise anyone in science to co-produce research projects. So we believe that there are strong biases. It could be that some of these biases are due to fewer hospital visits, and most likely we believe to social and economic health factors. There are barriers to diagnosing and managing ME, and I'll come on to that in a minute, and those will need to be overcome. The reference 26 that we refer to in the preprint, I apologize for all the words, but the words really talk about the barriers to diagnosis. And these are stereotypical beliefs and religious beliefs and other aspects that are discussed in that reference. And I would just point out many people to it. You can reach it via our preprint. Now, I want to talk about the fact that we found that there were 176 large active GP practices without a single person registered as an ME patient. And when we looked at where these practices are located, they are predominantly located in areas that are most deprived in England. So if there were minimal social and healthcare barriers to ME diagnosis, what would be the diagnosis rate across the UK? So if we were to match the rates to NHS Cornwall and Isles of Scilly, which basically has the highest prevalence for white females and males, and also have the largest proportions of females and of the oldest population. Applying these values to the UK, we come to an estimate of almost 400,000 people with ME across the United Kingdom, which is a 50% increase over the previous estimate. But of course, because our data is only from hospital admissions, it does not account for GP diagnosis that are not recorded in the data. So it could be an underestimate. Could also be an overestimate because not everyone who is coded has been found eventually to adhere to ME criteria. So most of my thanks go to Gemma Sams, funded by ME Research UK, who performed the research. The money to access the data came from MRC and IHR, and thank you to everyone, including the PPI and Helen Baxter, for all the fantastic work they've done in Decode ME. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. That was another thought-provoking presentation. The 3 presentations were quite different. My own interest, by the way, is very much in participative research, so I totally agree with Chris about co-production and the relevance of that. But this morning is for me an excellent example of a platform to discuss these research ideas. So I think we have a couple of minutes for discussion. Is there anyone who wants to just raise your hand? I think that would work if you want to respond or ask a question to any of the three speakers. I can't see everybody on the little video screens at the top. Alan, do you see
Could
anyone?
I ask a question?
Oh, Jess, go ahead. Yep. Could you
Hello
introduce
there.
yourself and ask a question?
Hi there, I'm Jess Freckles. I'm a clinical academic at Brighton and Sussex Medical School, working with Harm and Monica to try and do some clinical trial work in MECFS and related groups like fibromyalgia and long COVID. I mean, the presentations that we've had, I mean, they've been brilliant, but to be honest, they were actually quite disturbing and chilling, really, in terms of the scope of how many people are being missed, about the intersectional implications, and also about you know, people probably wouldn't be eligible to take part in clinical trials without a diagnosis. And if so many people are not receiving a diagnosis, what does that mean? I know we can't answer this question, and it's probably also to think about in the breakout groups, but does anyone have any sort of amazing light bulb ideas about how we can move forward and try and create more inclusive spaces for research? What would the speakers' top 3 tips be to try and make this a more equitable playing field?
I see 2 hands from Sarah and Alan, but I'm not sure they respond to this call from you, Jess. Sarah, is that
Well, one comment on that is from my experience of working in other conditions where, particularly in stroke, where there's a high incidence of stroke in South Asian populations, but people often don't approach for healthcare or you know don't seek healthcare, or often not till late. So we've been doing some work looking at how to improve access in those populations. They also tend not to take up community-based care and rehabilitation, and the key was actually having contact, if you like, champions who had a contact with the local community, who had standing, it's the word that comes to mind, it's not the right, but credibility, I guess, and trust, and a standing within those communities, who then kind of would interact and raise stroke directly with them. So it was very much had to be on a local and almost an individual basis. And also you can't assume that somebody who has contacts and worked with one particular community can't then translate it across to another community. So in Manchester, we had different people working with South Asian groups, with Afro-Caribbean groups, with the Chinese community in Manchester. So it's slow and it's very expensive.
I suppose it needs to be both at a grassroots level, as you described, but also very much at a national policy level as well, in terms of changing medical school and other professional curricula to include more information about these conditions so that people are more readily diagnosed, and about improving access to diagnostic services. I mean, I absolutely agree that involving the community is absolutely completely essential, Sarah, but we risk making it the community's responsibility rather than the nation's, if you see what I mean. So I think we must continue to, obviously they're not mutually exclusive, so we must continue to work hard on all fronts.
Absolutely. I wasn't saying that's the way it has to be done or the best way. It was just that was the way that we had. I mean, in stroke rehab, there've been people kind of aware of this issue and looking at how to improve it for a long time, and that is the kind of approach that has been most successful after lots of other approaches that have been less so.
Thanks. There are a few comments in the chat on possible ways forward. I think Alan, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Well, this is actually a question from somebody who couldn't be here today, who registered, but then had to drop out. And I thought it was pertinent. He says, our son was previously admitted to palliative care at his most severe. He twice spent several weeks in a hospice, and his care was coordinated for about 18 months by a palliative care consultant. With recent attention on very poorly managed harmful hospital admissions for very severe ME patients and the call for an NHS protocol, should there be research into whether palliative care settings should be considered in these circumstances, and for this to be written into care plans, i.e. anticipatory?
Whom does he pose the question to? To everybody? I would think we probably agree with this as a good idea. I don't think anyone wants.
Can I just say that was me?
Right, go ahead.
It was my wife who couldn't attend. It's our son. He's got very severe ME, but about 10 years ago he was even worse, and we were very lucky, I think, that he'd had a very bad experience initially trying to get him into hospital to see a neurologist, and subsequently there was an NDT meeting at home where the decision was made if he went into hospital again, he'd need to go into palliative care. And the contrast was amazing for us and for him. And in terms of the kind of care, the environment, the fact that we could stay with him, we still had to do a lot of educating, basically. But I just think that I'm not sure that's been mentioned very much in this discussion about what kind of care do people with very severe ME need when they go into hospital, and whether they're, in terms of research, then whether that's something that could be researched in some way, contrasting the experiences or contrasting the kind of care and the kind of environment that you encounter in those two different settings.
That must have been absolutely awful for him and the family, Rob, I think, too.
Yes, but I mean, we've actually, I'm sorry, I'm really talking too much, but we've actually been able to work. We've had some good and bad experiences, basically. And I think the whole thing about care planning is another area potentially that would be very useful to look into. So we've been able to incorporate aspects of the new NICE guidelines into a care plan. I wonder how many people with severe ME actually have a care plan, and to what extent then there's a preparation for if this person gets to the point where they need to be admitted to hospital. How will we do it? Are we prepared? Or that would avoid some of the terrible things that have been going on recently.
I think we know very few people have a care and support plan in place. We have developed the hospital passport, which is worth you having a look at, because you can actually put the information together in advance if you are having a hospital admission. I think palliative care has a lot to offer in terms that the consultants can prescribe things which typically doctors aren't able to, and they have a good knowledge of things like antiemetics, so they can keep the nausea under control. So I would like to see more palliative care involvement in people with severe and very severe ME.
But we need to know how people actually get access to palliative care successfully, because most cases who apply would be knocked back locally.
Well, thanks. You and your hand was up. Is that something that the thing you wanted to raise, or is there something else?
No. In the past, we've come across this where ethnic groups have common problems of access, etc., but also have individual burdens of disease like sickle cell, which doesn't translate. And the need to coordinate these and get a sort of cross-nation sort of balance of representation and, you know, feed are leading the sort of like rebalancing of representation was put onto the ethnic communities. And of course, they all each had their own burdens to try and cope with anyway. Yeah. So, you know, there's been a real lack of resourcing over years of trying to develop this obvious shortcoming. And I don't know if there has been progress that we can point to of models which should be being more usefully adopted and more widely sort of funded.
Thanks. Sorry, Ewan. I see 4 hands remaining and we have only 2 minutes. So I think the next one was Neil. Go ahead, Neil.
Hi there. Thank you, everyone. I work in primary care in inclusion health, and my interests in especially deprived populations and also sort of excluded groups. So lots of this discussion is very relevant, lots of excellent data. I guess what I'm seeing in some of those graphs is sort of the inverse care law, for those of you who are familiar with that. So this idea that in people who are in especially deprived populations, they tend to get worse access to care, they get underdiagnosed, they get undertreated. And I guess where I'm going with this is outside the specialist ME space, I'm happy to be part of the solution here, but I guess I'm just opening it up and saying, you know, how can we take this conversation to sort of so-called deep end primary care networks and clinicians like myself, and sort of to take the focus away from some of the clinical concerns, which include sort of drug taking and alcoholic liver disease and so on, and sort of make some of these more chronic, invisible issues, put that onto the clinical radar for people like me who work with especially deprived populations. So if anyone's interested in sort of working on that, I'm happy to talk.
Perhaps get in touch with you, Neil. That's good idea. I think, sorry, Sarah, I think we have one more opportunity for Anna before the break.
Thanks. I just wanted to quickly respond to Jessica's question and Sarah's response. And I think it's both. So Sarah describes really this bottom-up grassroots, and that's critically needed, right? You need the incorporation of people from the community, you need trusted partners from the community, and they need to be engaged and feel that there's trust. But as Jessica mentioned, we also need it to be top-down, right? And so there has to be pressure on what I describe as our gatekeepers, particularly in research. That's our funders, that's our journals. And so there has been some push in the US in terms of, particularly for clinical trials, in terms of reporting guidelines and having minimal amounts of individuals from ethnic minoritized groups, and having to report, and children as well, if the condition that you are researching regards children. And there has been some success even just with those limits. And so if you can't receive money to do the research that you want to do, if you don't include groups, people will find ways to include those groups because they want to keep getting grant funding. So I am also very much a proponent of co-production, but I think it needs to be both. So it has to be that grassroots, there has to be involvement from the community, but there has to be pressures and, I will say, consequences coming from top down.
It's a very vocal summary. Thank you so much, Anna. I think in the interest of time and for the rest of the program, Alan, Monica, what do? I think we plan to start again at 11:10. Shall we start 5 minutes later?
I think we need to, yes, just to give people the break. Thank you very much.
So this is a 9-minute break, everyone. We'll start again at 11:15. With two other very interesting presentations. The first one by Professor Sean Cherwick, Chair in Health Services Research at the University of Aberdeen, who leads Trial Forge, working to improve trial efficiency and supporting the NIHR Include initiatives with aims to improve trial delivery for underserved groups. Sean.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. So hopefully everybody can see a very purple screen right now. So as Harm said, I'm going to talk in some general terms about what we can do to improve equity, diversity, inclusion within health research. And I'll point towards MECFS as we go along. But, oops-a-daisy. Okay. There we go. What I'm really going to talk about are two things of a four-step process. And it's been brilliant to have the earlier talks because they set up what I'm going to say very, very nicely indeed, as we'll see. And just at the bottom, you'll note that I think in all of these steps, there's a very strong role for public contributors, so that co-production that we heard about earlier. And a caveat, I am not an MECFS expert at all, so this is not an area I've worked in myself. So I'll talk in general terms about how I think we can improve the way we do research to become more inclusive, and give some pointers to ME and CFS as well. These four steps, I think, boil down to really thinking about who do we actually need in our research. And as we've heard in those earlier talks, that is not really being done in the way that we would like it to be being done for many areas of research, and certainly MECFS. And we have to change the way we do those pieces of research to enable this broader involvement. We have to monitor what we're doing, and we have to report what we find. So I'll talk about all of those, but mostly the two underlined in red. Okay, so if we think about who, now I would argue that researchers such as myself have historically thought hard about how many individuals do we need to have in our research, and have thought hard about some of the clinical criteria that would make an individual eligible for a piece of research. But we have thought considerably less, if at all, about but exactly who are these individuals when we think about things like age and gender and sex and ethnicity and socioeconomic status, geography, for example, and that is a substantial change in the way we do research that is needed. And I completely agree with what Anna was saying, is that certainly we need co-production, as I mentioned on the earlier slide, but we absolutely 100% need high-level policy change, pushes from funders and others to make this sort of change. It is not a trivial change. We need to think much more carefully as researchers about exactly who are the people who we hope our research will help, and what can we do to make sure that those individuals are able to take part. Now, that first part, who do we need to involve? To me, initially, years ago, would sound quite simple. It's actually, I think, really quite difficult in many cases. And one of the primary reasons for that, and Chris highlighted this in his talk, is data, or rather the lack of it. An ability to say, these are the people who have this particular clinical condition, let's say it's MECFS, and also to have data that says these are the people by age, these are the people by gender, these are the people by socioeconomic status, these are the people by ethnicity. That's what we'd really like, to have an idea about who we need to involve, who has the condition, who could benefit. And those data are often not to be found in our experience. And I've not looked for it in MECFS, but in other areas, as we've heard in the earlier talks, often very hard to find these data. This particular project I'm flagging here, called STRIDE, has done some work linked around ethnicity and how we might make better choices even in the absence of data. But this is actually quite a hard task, and our history as researchers of collecting data that enable better decisions is a very large part of the problem. So this I did before realizing, in fact, that this is Chris's study that I've picked up here. So Chris's talk has been a perfect background to this. And as we heard in Chris's talk, there are some really substantial variations in the prevalence of MECFS, by, for example, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. And to somebody like me who is a non-expert, what that really cries out to me as well, we obviously then need to collect information and report that information on all of these things, because it seems odd to me as a non-expert to see this enormous variation. And I agree again with, I think, Chris, you said you don't think this variation can be easily attributed to biological difference. And I would absolutely agree with that. I think there's much more going on. And therefore, it's very important that these things are routinely collected and reported. And in my quick looking across some literature last week in MECFS, that does not seem to be the case. And I know, Chris, you pointed that out in your talk too. That's a problem. And therefore, for us working in this field of trials, in my case, but trying to improve diversity and inclusion, that first challenge we have is we need to get much better at collecting data on characteristics that are clearly important. And we also need to do that within the health service. The health service itself needs to get much better at collecting these data. And coming back to Anna's point, that needs policy change. That is not something easily that researchers are going to change. That's a policy decision at very high levels. We are now going to start collecting these data. Let's say you've made some decisions about who you need to involve. The next point is, and how will we do that? And the bottom line, as we heard from Helen's talk, is that you need to make some substantial changes to the way you design your research to enable individuals to take part because of their different perspectives, their different views about the research, and of course their clinical condition and the impact it has on their ability to take part. So generally speaking, I would say if a design looks like the last one you did, you are doing something wrong with regards to making your research more inclusive. And I absolutely point the finger at myself in that regard too. Things need to be done differently. Now, there are some tools that can help, and some of the include frameworks that I and my colleagues have been involved with can help, in particular in flagging issues which need to be addressed. So essentially, those frameworks are a series of questions that essentially highlight things you need to think about. But this middle bit of text about the robust evidence, because of other work I do, particularly around recruitment and retention, I can say, irrespective of clinical area, there is very, very little robust evidence of strategies that researchers could use and confidently expect that they would improve the involvement of historically underserved groups. So I think Jessica's point earlier about disturbing and chilling, this is part of that picture. We have very little high quality evidence of effective strategies to involve different groups of people in pretty much any clinical area we could think of, and certainly MECFS. As a starter, though, we've heard some of these words already. For many groups, and right at the first talk from Anna, where we think about ethnicity, trust can be a really substantial problem. I think Anna used the phrase hostile environment. I've also heard that phrase brought up in discussions with diverse ethnic communities, and the hostile environment created by Theresa May more than a decade ago influences health decisions now. So building up trust is an important thing to work on if we want to work with historically underserved groups, communicating in a way that is tailored to the questions that people have and is delivered in a way that works. And we heard some great examples from Helen of doing that, is important, as is convenience, which we also heard from Helen about too, making the delivery of our piece of research to be designed around the participants, not around ourselves. So those three things crop up a lot in the work I'm doing, but we have to recognize as researchers, we have not done a great job in generating good evidence of how to improve inclusion of underserved groups, or to add of others. We're not great at doing that. So just to flag one thing, which is we've already heard of, we could use one of these frameworks and we might find in one of our trials or pieces of research that we use that diagnosis of MECFS. And as we've heard from Chris and others, if you use that diagnosis as a starting point, I would say that that is going to bake in inequality into that study because of the difficulty that individuals have in receiving that diagnosis, and that difficulty varies across different groups. So some groups are much less likely to be in your research based on that single criterion. And that is something we need to recognize and work around. What can we do? Because otherwise we're going to bake in an inequality, is my sense from what I've heard today and from what I was reading while preparing this talk. We also heard a little bit earlier about South Asian communities, I think in part of the discussion, how it is, for example, MECFS describes in the South Asian community as an example. What would be acceptable ways of dealing with MECFS for members of these communities? I don't know. I'm a white, British, middle-class, educated man. I don't know. The key point is it means talking to people who are like the people you need to involve in your research and finding their perspectives and their concerns and their beliefs about what the research should be doing, and then work to design that in to your piece of research. There is a need for co-production in the way that we have heard already. I'm going to talk less about these last two items. If we've made efforts to identify who needs to be in the study, and we've made efforts to change our design to enable those individuals to take part and stay involved, we also need to monitor how we're doing it while we're doing our research. We need to set a target, essentially, for this is the proportion of individuals from this group that we want in our research, that we need in our research, that we must have, and we need to monitor that. And what that may mean, and there are other examples from other trials where this has happened, was that we have to stop recruitment of some types of individuals to allow others time to take part, to get involved. We have in the past, I think, run too quickly towards our overall, this is the number we want, and filled up our research slots by people from particular segments of society. Often in the UK, that would be white, British, educated males and females, but particularly perhaps males. To stop that happening, we need to be willing to take action. So monitoring how we're doing is very important during the trial. And as we've also heard, we need to get better at reporting. Who do we want in our research? Who did we get in our research at the end? And what, importantly, are the implications of any differences? How applicable is our evidence given who is in the research compared to who we know we wanted to be in that research? So we all need to get better at reporting. And I heard journals mentioned as one of those, if you like, policy level groups with responsibilities, and that's absolutely correct. There are reporting requirements that should be coming at the end from journals, and there are reporting requirements that should be coming at the beginning from funders and approvers, such as the Health Research Authority here in the UK. Reporting is difficult. There is some advice, if you like, can help as to what sort of things you could measure routinely. You could have a look at this one here. It's called Pro-EDI. But again, it's tricky, and we have work to do as a research group to move things forwards. But without doing it, we'll be having this conversation in another decade without having made much difference. So to summarize, then, we need to think very carefully about who needs to be involved in our research, much more carefully than we have previously. We had great talks this morning highlighting why that's important. And to actually enable those individuals to be involved means making change. Our designs need to change. And also, as we've heard, those changes are likely to make the research slower, will take more time, and more expensive. And we have to accept that. And importantly, funders need to accept that. If we want to take this seriously, research will cost more and it will take longer, because we need to build in different methods of involving people in our research to ones we have used in the past. We need to monitor what we're doing. We need to evaluate it to build up that rigorous evidence. And we need to report what we found much, much better. And again, just to emphasize, in all of this work, there are very, very important roles for public contributors. Co-production is central, and I'll just flag again, as Anna did, there is a need too for policy level change. And that's it. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. I'll stop sharing now.
Thanks so much, Sean. That was a very engaging and well considered presentation. I just hope that with the new government, the UK winds will change a little bit in terms of hostile environment and all that. Jess, do you want have a brief comment or question?
I was just wondering, I think it's so important about what you were just saying about the journals and the funders. And Harm and I and Monica, had this experience recently of applying for funding for a clinical trial of LDN, which was sort of rejected, we think, on the grounds of being too expensive. And one of the things is we had costed in a year of co-production at the beginning to make sure that we got the outcomes that were sort of meaningful for the community, and also, tried to reach the underserved groups. What I wonder is, we need so much flexibility, not just from the funders, but from ethics committees and all sorts of things to do this kind of very much what we need, like dynamic research, essentially. And I wonder how we can work together to petition funders in particular to acknowledge that if you were doing this sort of research, and indeed most scientific and health research should be like this, that you need a flexible design, a flexible budget, and a flexible ethics.
Yeah, Sean, you want to respond to that?
I do. So I completely agree. And there are things afoot, if you like, that I know of personally because I'm involved with them, where we are trying to give some of that pressure to, for example, the Health Research Authority, which is why I mentioned them. So an approver responsible for ethics committees, also the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Products Agency, in case it was a drug. So we're doing stuff with them too, and also with funders such as National Institute for Health and Care Research. I think where we have opportunities, and I do have some opportunities from time to time to push this problem. It will cost more. It will take longer. We will need flexibility. We should push it as individuals and groups wherever we can. So as charities and organizations, push. But I don't think this is a change that will happen in 1 year. I think this is a longer term effort, and we just keep pushing and pushing and pushing.
Yeah,
I think
it needs time.
I think there's hope. There's reason for, it will take time, and there's reason for hope, but it's not something that's going to change very quickly.
Ewan has his hand up. Do you want to respond to this, Ewan?
No, I'm just going to bring another point in. We obviously have a need to develop things from the research side, but part of the equation is developing the ability to provide good subjects, which means developing the accuracy in diagnosis and treatment and caseness and recording in primary care particularly, and secondary care. And the things we need in parallel to be looking at how you workshop that to provide models. The other thing that came out was you look at surveys, and surveys obviously almost always now include excuse me, questions on ethnicity, etc., and some social background, maybe not the full socioeconomic background, which again you have to think about where the modelling is and what needs to develop there. But that survey data tends not to be really used. It's been collected, but has been sort of like set aside largely. So is there an underused resource that we can actually go back and sort of retro gather? Okay.
Okay. In the interest of time, Johnny wants to respond just briefly.
Only to say I agree, and I think we should use whatever data are available to make the case to policy level individuals that look, there is a problem, and that problem needs to be addressed, and it fits in with the strategies often that funders are saying. It's just that the implementation of those strategies is often lacking. I think we just need to keep pushing.
Thanks so much, Sean. That was great. I would
you.
like to continue now with the final presentation by two speakers, Professor Nisreen Alwan, Professor of Public Health, and Dr. Donna Clutterbuck, Research Fellow, University of Southampton. Together they will discuss the long COVID inequalities research, part of the Stimulate ICP study of long COVID. Nisreen and Donna, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, and can you see the first slide, long COVID inequalities? Yes, excellent. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for inviting us to talk. I was very, very, very interested in the discussions just now about sort of the include agenda and research funding and panels, and I can go on that, but let me not digress. But I'm really, really interested in this topic, and I think there is even a mismatch between research funders' guidance or what they want and actually what the panels do when they assess the funding. So that's another discussion, or obviously relevant discussion. So we're going to talk a little bit about long COVID because there are some really kind of, you know, some common themes there. So I'm going to start and then hand over to Donna to talk a little bit about specifically about our study, but just in the way of introduction. So long COVID, I want to say first, I came into long COVID because I experienced it myself, you know, in the first wave, following the first wave 2020, and Anna talked at the start about that sort of that kind of spurious sort of line of subjective versus objective and researchers versus patients, which I kind of experienced and lived, you know, in real life. So very, very important to also kind of make sure that we change our culture and research towards like, we are human, we have, you know, we have experiences as well. And whether we experienced a condition or not, lived and unlived experiences, and how we kind of put those into context. So I came into long COVID and then been doing some research and kind of advocacy in this area for the last few years. So long COVID can be defined in different ways, slightly different ways, but generally it's not recovering after having COVID. So what Chris talked about sort of that maybe quite kind of wider category of post-viral disease. It can manifest as ongoing symptoms following the acute infection or new symptoms. It can manifest as functional disability, or some sort of observed pathology on investigations, even in so-called mild COVID-19 cases. And so they're not really mild if they carry on for months or years, you know, afterwards. And the mechanisms are still, there is quite a bit of research looking into the mechanisms of long COVID now, but still there's no one definitive mechanism. It could be around sort of things around possible persistent viral infection, autoimmune disease, damage to the organs, or sort of inflammatory response. So I put in the NICE guidance here, and it kind of classifies it into acute COVID, ongoing symptomatic between 4 and 12 weeks, and then post-COVID-19 syndrome, which is really what is termed in the UK in terms of healthcare. The World Health Organization also has a clinical case definition, and it's similar in that it is a it's an illness following probable or confirmed SARS-CoV-2 infection, usually 3 months and more, and it cannot be explained by alternative diagnosis, which is, again, you could argue that people could get diagnosed in the medical records as a result of having long COVID. So that's something to consider, and includes wide range of symptoms, including fatigue, shortness of breath, brain fog, post-exertional malaise, or post-exertional symptom exacerbation. So some of these symptoms definitely overlap with MECFS. So we did a big systematic review to look at the prevalence, how common is long COVID, and we found it's included more than 100 studies, mostly before vaccination, because we now know that vaccination has an effect on reducing the occurrence and the prevalence of long COVID, though that doesn't prevent it completely. And I wanted to flag this just to see that, to say that the variation is between 0 to 93% of all people who get infected with COVID experiencing long COVID, and that variation comes mainly or largely from the method of assessment and how we assess long COVID. Are we asking people whether they have it? Are we looking at clinical records? Are we actually following people and doing some tests and scans? And that variation comes from that, and actually a very concerning that we found. Not only we expected that the self-reported will be more higher prevalence generally than the kind of clinical records, because of all the disparities that we have talked about today around sort of who gets diagnosis and care, and we're going to talk about this a bit. But also we found that those who got followed up, the studies that followed up people and did some tests or scans, found the highest prevalence. So that's quite concerning. The ONS used to do regular updates on the prevalence of long COVID, and this is the last one from the original method, which is testing everybody in their sample whether they had COVID and then following up for symptoms, and it's about 2 million people, and that was in March 2023, so about 3% of the population, so really big percentage of people experiencing, and one in 5 of those people has their activities limited a lot. ONS, the Office of National Statistics, released another estimate, more recent estimates of long COVID, sort of in March 2024, which found similar results. However, it did use a different methods, and it's not a continuation of the first method, but also illustrating that importance of how you assess a condition like long COVID. So in this more recent one, they asked people, when did your long COVID start? Which is actually a very difficult question to answer, because you could kind of tell when your COVID infection started, but because of the nature of long COVID and the kind of comes and goes and fluctuating and sort of the continuation, it's really hard to pinpoint when you think your long COVID started. So again, it's about that. It's really important how we measure long COVID, and that the way we ask the question, it differs by in terms of how it gets interpreted and answered by how much stigma people experience and sort of what background they're from, and I'll talk about this in a minute. The ONS original data showed differences by certain characteristics. So we know females are more likely to experience long COVID, but not that huge gap that was sort of more sort of widely popular at the start of the pandemic, and that it was almost exclusively experienced by women. And we know that the working age population, sort of that age between 35 to 60, is the most common to experience it. By the index of multiple deprivation, we see people in the most deprived quintile, fifth, almost double the risk of those in the least deprived, so definitely a gradient there by deprivation. And we see that people who have had existing health conditions or disability much more likely to experience it. Huge variation as well by type of profession, and that also reflects on kind of the group or the population, and how flexible, because what your job is affects whether you get long COVID, whether you're frontline, transport, healthcare, social care, teaching, but also how you cope with it, because you need that lots of flexibility in terms of coping with having long COVID. I wanted to show this. It is called the Wheel of Power of Privilege, because this is what we're talking about here, really. All the inequalities and the disparities we talk about are not, they don't come in single dimension. We're all, a culmination of these categories, gender, skin color, education, ability, wealth, housing. All of us, sit somewhere, in each of those colored segments. And the combination of those segments shape our sort of risk and shape our, the inequalities we experience, because these segments are shaped by the social structures in society. And that sort of angle of intersectionality, which is what I'm talking about, definitely interacts with sort of having long COVID, getting COVID and then getting long COVID in terms of how how much, in terms of your treatment and rest, or kind of, how you deal with it, living with it, all of these dimensions interact. So we did a survey of long COVID stigma. So the stigma experienced by people with long COVID, largely based on, sort of stigma dimensions measured in conditions like MECFS and HIV. And in this survey, people told us that 34% regretting having told others about their illness, and about 2/3 said they were very careful about who they tell about their illness. We assess stigma using 3 dimensions: enacted stigma, so the bits at the top here in sort of blue, and it's basically the perceived experience of discrimination, when they talk about or in their interactions about long COVID. There is the internalized stigma, which is the feeling of shame and feeling of embarrassment for having, that condition, and kind of, again, talking about it, interacting about it. And then the purple group is about anticipated stigma. So this is what people expect to get, the discrimination they expect to get if they go and seek help or care or talk about their long COVID with family, friends, employers, professionals. And we found very, very high levels of all dimensions of stigma, as you can see here. And actually, we found that those who had a definitive clinical diagnosis of long COVID were more likely to report those dimensions of stigma, and which was surprising at the start, but actually come to think of it, these are the people who might have had to talk and interact more about their condition in order to get to the stage of having a definitive clinical diagnosis. I'm going to hand over to Donna to speak over the next few slides around our community-based case finding, where we try to find people in the community who haven't got a clinical diagnosis of long COVID. Donna, are you here?
Yes, thank you, Nisreen. So yeah, as Nisreen said, the purpose of this study was to identify people in the community who didn't yet have a clinical diagnosis of long COVID. So the study was co-designed with a community advisory board, which was made up of people living with long COVID, people caring for people with long COVID, and also some clinicians, some of who also had long COVID themselves. We distributed a leaflet in the communities in Camden, Merton, and in Derbyshire, which on the screen, we show it on the screen, which just had a few symptoms and just asked people if they felt that these symptoms applied to them to contact the research team directly. Sorry, could I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so people who interacted with the leaflet and felt that they could potentially have long COVID would contact the research team directly, where we went through a screening questionnaire just to check eligibility. Those who were eligible were invited to take part in an interview about those experiences. So eligibility for the study was based on adults without a clinical diagnosis of long COVID. So or a known clinical diagnosis of long COVID, and they had to have symptoms consistent with long COVID and had a case of a confirmed case of COVID or probable long COVID. Participants who completed the interview were offered a shopping voucher as a gesture of thanks for their time, but they were also offered a referral to a social prescribing service, and that was because from the early community advisory board meetings we found that although obviously people wanted help with their symptoms, their medical symptoms, and they wanted that support, but they also wanted support with things like social support or economic support, debt support, for example. So we included the social prescribing referral within study, and most people took up that referral as well. So from the interviews, we completed 23 interviews with people with probable long COVID. And we found that there was inadequate awareness of long COVID, and that was both in terms of the symptoms consistent with long COVID, but also in terms of where to get support for their symptoms. There was also a perceived lack of awareness of long COVID within healthcare. We found that the people had uncertainty, so self-doubt about the cause of their symptoms. And sometimes this was reinforced by interactions with healthcare professionals. We also found that there was hesitancy in seeking care, and there were different reasons for this. So some people were worried about the implications of seeking care, for example, being offered medications that they might not want to take, or some people were just worried about what would happen next if they did have a diagnosis. We also found that there were experiences of stigma and discrimination, and that was so I should say we used some of the questions from the long COVID stigma scale, which Nisreen has just mentioned, and we found that there was experiences of stigma and discrimination in this group of participants too. And this was in the form of age and gender discrimination. People said that they felt that they were dismissed and felt that they experienced discrimination from others in the community as well. We also found that the experiences of people with long COVID equated to epistemic injustice. So this. Sorry?
I think it's just somebody not muted. Yeah, carry on.
Yeah, so epistemic injustice. So that's inequalities surrounding knowledge. So that could be inequalities in whose knowledge is taken seriously, so who is believed, but also inequalities in who is able to interpret knowledge, so to understand about their situation. And for people with long COVID, that was often because there wasn't a reference point for long COVID. There wasn't established reference point. So we published this study in a journal, and we also made some recommendations based on the study findings. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but I will just draw your attention to one, and that was that we used the findings from this study and the HICO study, which I believe Nisreen is going to talk about in a moment, to create a web tool to help people with long COVID. So it's predominantly aimed at people who might not be clear whether they have long COVID, but it could also be used by people who know they have long COVID, but also professionals who treat people with long COVID too. So I'm just going to hand back to Nisreen.
Thank you. So just 1 minute. I know we're up to time. This is the HICO study that I was involved in, led by Nina Smythe at University of Westminster, and they looked exclusively at ethnic. We looked exclusively at ethnic minorities with long COVID, and definitely lots of negative experiences that reflect the findings, some of the findings that Donna talked about in terms of the stigma and the discrimination experiences and the dismissal. Just wanted to kind of put things together, because I think what's happening with long COVID, and certainly can be relevant to ME, is an inverse care law in which where people who would need the care the most are the least likely to get it. And this is shaped by these wider health inequalities dimensions around employment, poverty, the social systems of disadvantage, and that's all reflecting things around information and awareness about what to do, health literacy and self-advocacy, how much you push to actually get some care and support, and then obviously a postcode lottery in terms of who you get in terms of that, professional care and understanding of the condition, and the stigma, stereotyping and structural bias, and the lack of trust based on all these experiences. This is the tool. We're going to put it in the link that Donna mentioned, Long COVID Care, Supporting Long COVID Care tool. And we hope with that this online tool help people kind of identify with some of these painful experiences, basically, and kind of reflect some of the quotes that we found from the research, to actually kind of say, well, we're not alone here, and there's ways that we are encouraging people to reach out for care and support. But also, this is also aimed at professionals, social, community organizations, healthcare professionals, friends, family, and employers, so that they understand the complexity that, of the experience of having such under-recognized and sort of stigmatized conditions. So when they're having those conversations, there is this at the background, rather than, a more simple sort of yes, no dismissal conversation. I think I want to thank.
Thanks very much. The strangest thing happened, that there was a fire warning in my building, so I'm now outside taking over this on my phone. So that means I have no access to the chat or anything. I think we have a few minutes left for discussion. Perhaps Ellen or Monica, you can have a look whether people want to reply to this wonderful presentation from Nisreen and Donna.
Nothing in the chat so far.
All right.
I'm going to just raise a couple of other issues. There are some people.
Go ahead, Monica.
There are some people who haven't selected breakout groups. Can they please do so and put it in chat? There are some people whose names are not the same as what they registered with, or are not clear who they are. Can they make that clear? Otherwise, Claire can't put them in a group. And I need to speak to the leaders of the group leaders for the research on provision for people with ME who are already minoritized or socially disadvantaged. If we can get together quickly at the start of the next break, and then we can go away for the break, etc. Questions. I mean, everyone is raising the same issues. It's how we move forward to highlight the problems in a way to improve the services for people with ME. Have people, I mean, for instance, Professor Olwan, have you got suggestions now for how we can overcome some of these barriers, having started this research?
Yeah, so I think the recommendations, which we can put also a link to the paper that we did long COVID. We haven't done direct research on ME, so it is very, we don't want to generalize, because long COVID can have a different context, but it has a lot of relevant sort of points, and indeed some people with long COVID get eventually diagnosed with ME. So I think it's really important that everybody is more aware of this, we stress the stigma because it's really an important mover of the interaction between people with the condition and everybody else, you know, the professionals, their kind of circles and surroundings and employers and everybody else. And I think we need to have more explicit sort of stigma awareness training in all of these settings, because then the person experiences stigma can actually express it and say, look, you know about this, I'm experiencing this type of discrimination or feeling, or I'm, you know, feeling very overwhelmed with, you know, all these reactions, and the professional would be aware of, you know, what this person is talking about. And I think even though we can't get everybody to work well in this context, I think the actual having a reference point into these conversations, saying, well, you might not recognize it, but you know, there is all this guidance and all of these sort of evidence around it, and this is, you know, I'm experiencing this in this setting. I think that is really important to kind of and to move from that sort of very transactional sort of transactional kind of scenario of where these are, you know, this is my condition, these are my symptoms, this is what you get, and actually saying, yes, but I am talking about potentially this condition, and this condition has got all this associated sort of a wider dismissal or stigma around it, and, you know, something to refer to around this, I think is really important in this context, I guess. I mean, we've made some other recommendations which can be general, you know, about offering time, you know, about talking in consultations, which is kind of a whole system thing. The tools like we've developed is something that people can take with them and say, look at this, you know, that's not just me, this is happening, this is a wider issue, and, you know, we need to talk about it.
Harm, we have
Sarah's got
Sarah
a question.
Tyson, Ewan Dale, and Monica.
Sarah first.
Yeah, because in the interest of time, could you keep it short?
Well, I wanted to bring up an issue that's occurred to me a few times while we've been discussing the underserved groups, and to play devil's advocate, it's the apparent sex inequality in that there are a lot more women diagnosed with ME than men, and that seems to be assumed to be that that's because men aren't being diagnosed with it. But ME has an autoimmune element, which I know we don't really understand it, but there's definitely an element there, and all autoimmune conditions affect women more than men. So do we really know that this is an inequality thing, or is it just that more women than men get ME? And is this a kind of reverse discrimination in that there's an assumption that men should be the main players in there, and maybe they shouldn't?
Thank you, Sarah. In the interest of time, I'll wrap this up shortly. Ewan, you had another point?
Yeah, just presumably when you are doing this, you're looking around for models of what other illness studies have found in the way of, you know, what's causing inclusion or preventing inclusion. And I wonder if there was a robust central approach to how the population is seen in these terms that we could all be looking to refer to.
Anyone wants to respond to that? Well, we'll note the question. Thank you very much, Ewan. Monica, do you have a final thing to say or comment to make?
It's a quick one. There is a research, there are educational materials being developed at the moment for ME, coming out of the government initiative on ME CFS. I think it would be quite important if we could get a module in that about underserved groups. And if anyone wants to work with me on trying to approach the groups responsible for that, I would be really, really interested. Thank you.
Super, thanks. I think it's 12 o'clock, so we've come to the end of a wonderful and for me a rather challenging meeting, because I just had to run out and run back because of the fire somewhere. I would like to thank Monica, Alan, Claire, and others for organizing this wonderful but complicated meeting, I think. And I would certainly like to thank all the presenters who did a really good job, I think, and everyone else who attended and joined our conversations. I think in 1 or 2 minutes we'll probably go back to the breakout rooms. Monica, I think is that correct?
Yes. If people want a quick break, can we keep it to 5 minutes maybe? The breakout rooms can extend longer than 1/2 if people have had the stamina. The actual call, the Zoom call, will last till 1:45. But as I said,
they can stay on the same link, right, Monica?
Stay on the same link. Claire Ogden has already allocated most people to groups. We just need to sort out the underserved groups breakout room.
Okay, I'll hand the chair to you back to you then, Monica. Then.
Thank you.